Good afternoon, everyone. This session will be held in English. On behalf of the Association of Researchers on Spiritism, I would like to thank you all for attending the 16th National Meeting. On this occasion, the event takes place entirely online. Initially, we would have the participation of Dr. Julie Beischel, but she's recovering from a health issue. That makes it impossible for her to be with us today, and she apologizes for the absence. Taking over the presentation, we are pleased to have Mark Boccuzzi, who, in addition to being Dr. Beischel's husband, is also co-founder of the Windbridge Research Center. But to properly introduce our guest speaker, at this point, I give the floor to Dr. Tristan Torriani.
Welcome. I would like to welcome our guest, Mark Boccuzzi, and thank him for accepting our invitation. Mark Boccuzzi is a Psy researcher based in Arizona. He's executive director of the Windbridge Research Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to research around survival of consciousness after death that he founded in 2008 together with his wife and research partner, Julie Beischel, PhD. He will share with us today his cutting-edge research on mediums and mediumship. The floor is yours, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint, so I'll go ahead and get that set up here. Just 1 second. Just give me 1 moment, and I will have that ready. Here we go. Okay, you should be seeing my screen. I hope that's true. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Mark Boccuzzi. I'm co-founder and executive director of the Windbridge Research Center. Sorry, clicking on things. Okay, I've been conducting mediumship research since 2008, and I'm a full member of the Society for Scientific Exploration. I'm also a professional member of the Parapsychological Association, and I've published a dozen or so, or co-published papers on mediumship and afterlife topics in various peer-reviewed journals and academic texts. So today I want to talk a bit about the research at the Windbridge Research Center. We cover a number of areas, including the population that we deal with, our research approach, some results of our research, and I'll talk about some challenges and next steps. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the population that we work with. Now, mediumship and mediumship phenomena and mediumship research takes place around the world. And at the Windbridge Research Center, we focus on a very, very narrow piece of that, which is modern US-based secular mental mediums. And the research I'm going to talk about today is all based around that population. So a mediumship reading appears to involve the sitter, the medium, and the discarnate, and each can impact the success of a reading. So as with any form of human communication, it's important that all three of these people are able to work together in order to produce a successful reading. Now, at the Windbridge Research Center, it's very important to us that we pre-screen all of our participants before they participate in research programs. So, for example, all the mediums we work with have passed an 8-step pre-screening process that can take months to complete. And after they've completed the process and they've been accepted into the program, they're known as Windbridge Certified Research Mediums. And each medium is required to donate time back to the lab to help us with further research. We also pre-screen our sitters, the people that receive readings, because we need them to be able to accurately understand our scoring system. And we also think about the discarnate, the deceased individual that the medium is communicating with and and that the sitter wants to connect with. We want to make sure that there's some sort of emotional connection between the sitter and the discarnate, because we want to try to incentivize the discarnate to take part in our research. So that covers our general population. So, and the big takeaway there is that it's very important for us to pre-screen all of our research. So I want to talk about our research approach. And we have a sort of a basic philosophy here, which is we want to study the phenomena as it is, not how we want it to be. Oftentimes when we talk to people about mediums and mediumship, they say, oh, well, if a medium can really talk to a deceased person, then they should be able to do it under these conditions and provide this kind of information. And often that's not the case. So we want to make sure that we're always focusing on how the phenomena actually presents itself through the scientific process of observation. So our primary approach also includes what we call optimizing for success. So we want to make sure that we're pre-screening all of our participants and we're ensuring some sort of a discarnate motivation. We want to ensure that the experiment matches the lived experiences of the mediums. And we want to protect our participants. And then we do that by respecting the mediums and their process. And also the sitters. Many of the sitters we work with are often suffering from traumatic grief. So we want to make sure they're able to get the support they need and they understand the exploratory nature of the experiments in which they're taking part of. We also want to maximize our experimental controls, and by this I mean we need to do really good science. We need to make sure we're using proper masking or blinding, that we're using proper randomization techniques, that our protocols are tightly designed, we're using proper statistics, and we're reporting our data properly. So we also think about our research as a holistic system. And there are three overlapping and interacting parts to that system. The first is what we call information research, where one of the primary questions is, can mediums report accurate and specific information about the dead? The second is operations research, which is, can mediumship provide insight into the survival hypothesis and the nature of consciousness? And third, can this help people? So we're interested in applied research around mediumship and afterlife topics. So the takeaways for our researcher approach are optimize the conditions for success, maximize, and think about it in terms of a holistic system. So I want to go through some results really quickly from our research. So all the things I'm going to talk about today are based on the current state of the data, and of course these results may change as new data become available, which is the nature of science. So the first result I want to discuss is some mediums under controlled laboratory conditions can report accurate and specific information about deceased people. And we published about this in 2015 in a paper called Anomalous Information Reception by Research Mediums Under Blinded Conditions. And in this study, we reported mediums that were able to produce over 50 readings in which it was demonstrated that they were in fact able to report accurate and specific information about deceased people under tightly controlled conditions. And that finding was recently upheld through a recent meta-analysis that was just published in Explore, the journal Explore, which concluded that the results indicate that some mediums can receive anomalous information about deceased persons. Now, the specific protocol we use to test mediumship accuracy is pretty complicated, and I'm not going to have time to go through it all here, but it covers all of the known confounds that can arise when dealing with mediums and looking at the statements that mediums make. So there is a short video online, you can find it on our YouTube channel, which walks through all the experimental protocol. And there's also a fact sheet on our website, that you can download for free that that covers the results of that research. So the next finding I want to talk about is The experience of receiving communication from the deceased is different than retrieving psychic information about the living. And we published a paper about this in 2009 titled Science Survival, a Qualitative Investigation of Mediums Phenomenology Comparing Psychic Readings to Communication with the Deceased. And what that paper concluded was that Windbridge certified research mediums have the ability to differentiate between discarnate communication and their use of psi during a psychic reading. So to them, when they're talking to a deceased person or getting information from a deceased person, or they're getting information about the living person, that's qualitatively different to them. It feels different, and they can tell the difference. Now, that was a qualitative study, and we recently just submitted for publication a quantitative study that expands upon that research, called Somatic Signs Survival Psi, Exploratory Quantitative Phenomenological Analysis of Blinded Mediums' Experiences of Psychic Readings and Communication with the Deceased. And once that paper's published, we can talk more about that in detail. So, taken together, the fact that mediums can report accurate and specific information about the deceased, and they know when they're communicating with the deceased versus when they're receiving psychic information, if you take all that information together, it appears that mediums may actually be communicating with the dead. So now that we have a sense of the communication of mediums, we wanted to understand what's happening in their bodies. So in 2013, we published a paper with other researchers called Electrocortical Activity Associated with the Subjective Communication of the Deceased. And in this study, we found that EEGs of mediums suggest that the experience of communication with the deceased is different than remembering or imagining. So we asked the mediums to remember something and to imagine something and do a reading, and the activity in their brain looked different for those activities. And what's interesting about that find, is that claims made by skeptics that mediums are fabricating information or recalling facts are not supported by these data. They seem like those are different activities. So now that we had an idea of what's going on in a medium's brain, we were interested in what was happening in the rest of their bodies. So in 2019, we published a paper titled Hematological and Psychophysiological Correlates of Anomalous Information Reception in Mediums, a Preliminary Exploration. And what we found in that study was examining various components in the medium's blood, as well as basic physiological measures, showed that there was no hematological or physiological changes when comparing a psychic reading to a control reading. So in the mediums that we study, who are very experienced, there doesn't seem to be any stress or distress put on their bodies during the process of a mediumship reading, which is interesting in light of this next find. So survey findings have demonstrated that mediums have a significantly higher incidence of autoimmune diseases and a significantly higher general disease burden than do people who self-identify as non-mediums. So with that in mind, and the fact that that mediumship itself doesn't seem to be stressing the medium's bodies, a link between disease prevalence and childhood trauma in mediums has been proposed, and we're researching that further. One of the areas we're interested in as well is, as I mentioned, is application. So how can mediumship actually help people who are suffering from traumatic grief? To explore that idea more, we ran a study and we published a paper in 2015, The Possible Effects of Bereavement on Assisted After-Death Communication During Readings with a Psychic Medium, a Continuing Bonds Perspective. And the preliminary research from that study demonstrated that receiving a mediumship reading may be a positive healing effect on those who are suffering from grief after the death of a loved one. So what we really wanted to focus on in this study was this relationship to a grief model known as continuing bonds. and it's a model in which grief resolution includes an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. And this seems to fit well with the phenomena of mediumship and what mediumship can offer. And finally, using a fully blinded protocol similar to that employed to test mediums' accuracy during readings for deceased people, exploratory research has demonstrated that some mediums can report accurate and specific information about deceased companion animals. And Dr. Beischel presented on this in 2012 at the Society for Scientific Exploration meeting. And what's interesting here is that this is actually a pretty tricky area of research, because the level of grief and trauma experienced by people when they lose a companion animal is sometimes even greater than what they would experience when they were to lose a human companion. And so this makes working with this population a bit tricky, and we need to be very careful with them to ensure they're getting the proper support they need. So while this is something that affects a lot of people, we're very interested in pursuing it, but we have to pursue it in a very cautious and ethical manner. So if you want to get more information about these and other findings, I point you to our website, windbridge.org. You can see the studies that I talked about and get direct access to all the references. So what are the challenges of mediumship research here in the US, and what are some of our next steps? And I'll try to go through this quickly. So one of the biggest challenges from my perspective, and all of this is from my perspective as someone who runs a research center, is that medium research is actually really hard to do. It requires careful planning, it requires recruitment of participants, human subjects ethics reviews, staffing, and other resources. And unfortunately, all of that takes time and it takes funding. And mediumship research is, excuse me just a second, there's a serious lack of funding available for mediumship research in the United States. There's, the organizations that normally fund research in the U.S. are not interested at all in funding anything that looks like evidential mediumship research. So unfortunately, this difficulty of running these studies, along with the lack of research, has created kind of a difficult situation here in the U.S., or in general, in my opinion, which is we're seeing a rise in poorly designed and executed research. And that research is influenced by a number of different factors. So, for example, we're seeing people that are interested in the field or interested in mediumship research starting to conduct mediumship research, but they're not really trained and they don't really understand the literature or the nuance or the populations that they're studying. So we're seeing a lot of strange assumptions made about how the research should be conducted. The other piece is that researchers will take existing protocols, like the ones we use, for example, and then tweak them or change them and then refer to them as a replication, where it's really not if you change the protocol. And they don't take the time to pilot test the changes to their protocol. They just roll them into the study and don't understand the full ripple effect that might occur from making those changes and how it can undermine the credibility of the study or its impact on the participants. And the other thing we're seeing is that there seems not to be the effort that's required to pre-screen participants to ensure they're actually working with populations that can perform the tasks that they're asking people to do. On the other end of the spectrum, there are experimenters that aren't using established protocols and developing their own, and that's fine, but it's often those protocols don't take into account the lived experiences of mediums, so they're asking mediums to do things that they wouldn't normally do, and so they end up with an experiment which doesn't actually test mediums. It may be some sort of other psychic functioning using a mediumship population, but it would be difficult to call it a mediumship research program or study. And so what happens is when you have all these confounds and people start putting those experiments together and they start publishing them, the researchers won't often say, oh, well, I'm getting poor results or negative results, not because of changes that I've made or shortcomings in my protocols or designs, but it's because there's a problem with the mediums, or because maybe the original effect that was reported wasn't as robust as we had thought. And that is a real problem. And then this also feeds into the fact that there's a publication bias that happens with peer-reviewed journals, and that very few peer-reviewed journals, scientific journals, will publish positive results mediumship studies. But it's much easier to get results that are negative results published. And so because of this bias and this sort of interest in, and so when these negative results papers come in, journal editors and reviewers sort of take them as don't give them as much of a critical review as they probably should, and they're finding their way into the literature. And this again compounds the problem with funding. So with funders that were interested in funding mediumship research, they're seeing more of these negative results papers come out, and they're thinking, well, why are we spending resources on a phenomena that probably isn't real? So this is a serious problem, in my opinion, that's starting to emerge in the field of mediumship research, and we need to really think about how we're going to solve it or get around it. So in addition to these issues, there are also just some other specific issues in the US. So for example, lack of academic support. No one is teaching mediumship. Very few people are teaching mediumship research in formal academic settings. The media often will portray mediumship in sensational or inaccurate ways. And in the US, people aren't really interested in talking about death. And when they do, they talk about it through their religious or spiritual lens or beliefs, which don't actually have much room for science. So there's actually sort of not, amongst the general population, many people aren't actually interested in answering or having scientific answers to the questions that mediumship research provides. And I honestly don't know how to get around all these problems. These are the kinds of things that keep me up at night. So at the Windbridge Research Center, our research is going to continue the best we can with the resources that we have. So in our information arm, we're going to continue to educate people on our own and encourage them to perform true replications of the experiments. Our operations arm, we're still interested in looking at more things that are happening in mediums and sitters' brains using functional MRI, but those studies are probably going to be put off until the situation with COVID gets a little bit better. In the meantime, we have a lot of data that we've collected using various surveys and other techniques, and we're going to focus on publishing those data. But our main area is going to continue to be application. So we're going to continue to look at our bereavement and mediumship programs. We're going to look at our other afterlife experience or end-of-life experiences for both the dying and the families of the dying. We're going to look at other kinds of after-death communication experiences. And not only are we interested in applying what we find here to the grieving, but also to see how we can help mitigate death anxiety. So I'm going to wrap up. So thank you so much. And I invite all of you to visit our website, windbridge.org. You can join our email list. You can have access to all of our free educational materials that are all online, fact sheets, videos, wherever possible. If we have access to the original journal articles, all those are posted and linkable and searchable in the education section of our site. So thank you very much for your attention and time. I appreciate being here, and I'll now attempt to answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the interesting presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed learning about your important work that you and Dr. Beischel do at the Windbridge Research Center. According to our schedule, now we have 15 minutes for questions and answers. And I invite for this interaction Dr. Tristan Doriani. And Dr. Tristan is my colleague at Unicamp, State University of Campinas, Dr. Humberto Coelho and Dr. Mariana Costa, both members at the Research Center in Spirituality and Health of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora, e Rafael Carneiro, PhD candidate in computer science at the Federal University of Espírito Santo. Let me try here. Okay. Humberto, please.
Well, I would like to highlight one of the questions from the chat. Mark, have you had any support or partnership from within the spiritist or spiritualist communities? So we know that sometimes subjects or themes that are considered or perceived as religious, they may be supported by a church or by the John Templeton Foundation or something like that. Do you have any support of spiritualist or spiritist groups?
No, we don't, and we haven't really reached out to them, only because we started down this road of working with secular mediums, and that's the most common medium that's found in the U.S. today. So if someone were to go to Yelp or Google and want to get a mediumship reading, chances are that's who they would encounter. So when we started our research program, we primarily focused on that population, and that's where our research mediums have come from. There's nothing to say we couldn't branch out in the future, especially if there's financial support available through those organizations. But at this point, no, we haven't branched out, and we've stayed pretty much in our lane in terms of the mediums that we work with. Did that answer the question?
Dr. Mariana has a question, please.
First, I'd like to thank you, Mark, for your presentation. It was, I really appreciate this opportunity. Well, one of the most prolific Brazilian mediums, Chico Xavier, used to say that during communications, the phone rings from there to here. So, how to deal with the availability of the discarnate in the moment of the reading in your research? And as a psychiatrist, I would like to hear of you how the findings reported by mediumship research could impact in the understanding of mental disease. If it's possible to you to say what you think.
So the first part of the question about how the medium how the discarnate finds the medium and how the medium finds the discarnate, we get asked that a lot, and we don't really know, and the mediums don't know. The right discarnate seems to show up at the right time. Now, one of the things we do in our research is we do ask the sitters to mentally reach out to their discarnate that they want to talk to and invite them to take part in the reading. Now, when I say that, I want to be really clear here that the sitter doesn't know when the actual reading is going to take place, and we use proxy sitters, so the sitter isn't actually involved directly in the reading itself. The sitter will only receive a transcript of the final reading, and actually they receive 2 transcripts, but now I'm going into a lot of detail here that we don't need to go into. So it seems that process helps. That if the sitter reaches out to the discarnate and asks for their participation, the medium is able to connect with that specific discarnate. I hope that answers your question, or at least touches on it in the direction. As far as mental health issues go, we do look at the psychology of mediums, and from a mental health perspective, we're probably more, there's 2 pieces. We're interested in there's a tendency, at least in the US, to want to pathologize these experiences. And so we're doing our best to collect as much data about just how normal mediums are, like how well adjusted they are, how they respond on a wide range of psychological measures, like Big 5 personality inventories or other standardized tests. So we do have that program going on. I didn't have time to talk about it today. So one, we're trying to make sure that mediums that have these experiences aren't pathologized, And we're also, on the sitter side, we're trying to educate mostly therapists and social workers about the prevalence of these types of spontaneous after-death communication experiences and mediumship experiences that people have, so that they can bring those experiences into the therapeutic setting. So when we talked about mediumship being a potential therapeutic intervention for traumatic grief, what we really want to see is a joining of a mental health professional with the sitter who's had a reading, and help them integrate that process.
Okay.
Does that, I hope that helps.
Yes.
That addresses your question.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Rafael.
Okay. We often deal with mediums in Brazil, and they report experiencing regular communication with the deceased. And we also frequently hear from them descriptions about the spirit's world, how it looks like, what the spirits do in their common lives, what are their goals, their feelings, and what are tangible to them. So do you think it is a viable topic of research, the afterlife cosmology implied from those mediums' experiences?
That's really interesting, and I love the fact that you use the term afterlife cosmology. Is that a term that's actually used? Because I love it. So that's a really interesting question, and it's something that we actually have been thinking about here at the Windbridge Research Center for a while. And there was some preliminary work done where we asked various mediums about the experience of the afterlife. Excuse me. And it seemed as if, based on the speed of the answers and the content of the answers, that they might be falling back into their belief system more than the actual content. So we've developed a protocol. Excuse me, one second. Thank you. Pardon me. We've developed a protocol for a program we call VISTA, and we actually use what are known as remote viewers, and I don't know if that's a term that people are familiar with, but it's a process by which a trained psychic can be given information in a controlled and blinded or masked way, and receive information or report about information about distant locations, either through time or space. And this was the basis of the US military's psychic spying program back in the 60s through the 80s. And so we've employed remote viewers using a blinded protocol and given them targets in the afterlife. What is the afterlife like specifically? And can they connect with people in the afterlife? And we have preliminary data around this, and it's really interesting. Again, these remote viewers can be given any target, and we have them do actual life targets, and we have them do afterlife targets, and they don't know which is which. And the here life targets tend to be very accurate. The descriptions are very accurate. And then we give them the afterlife targets. They use words like ethereal and expansive and holy and engaging to describe the experience of the areas that they're viewing. And they often will say that they can see people, but it's through some sort of veil or mist that they don't normally experience when they view people in the here life. So I think it's a really interesting question, and we're trying to get at that through ways that might mitigate what's called analytical overlay from these other sources. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks.
Okay, Tristan, any questions?
Tristan, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mark, for your great presentation. I was saying that I was trying to catch up with your research, and it's so detailed that I really, I would like to just ask you a question that I hope it's not too philosophical. It's that when you're in the grip of this 18th century materialism that seems to, for whatever reason, we still seem to suffer from this view that if it's not something empirical or material and then it's tangible, then it can't be studied seriously. And on the other, let's say, extreme of this continuum, you have a loss of control of idealism and wishful thinking, and so it's a real struggle to try to find some middle position between them. But my question is, how do you deal with the conceptual aspect? Because if you don't, it's like a dilemma or a conundrum. It's because if you don't have a concept of a spirit to look for, you're never going to find a spirit, or any kind of communication, or it's incarnate. You need the concepts to look for the things, so that then you can, at the second moment, do empirical research geared towards capturing the phenomena for which you have a conceptual framework, a pre-existing conceptual framework that then you apply. Now, reductionist materialism a priori, beforehand, deprives you of even the possibility of finding these phenomena and addressing these phenomena. So somehow one needs to enrich one's theory, one has to develop concepts in a language which then we can use to investigate, approach phenomena. And so then that's where I think there's an aspect which in empirical research is somewhat underrated or not also appreciated, is that we need to develop concepts for empirical research. And my question is about communication. How can we develop concepts to grasp communication as a phenomenon better? Should we simply go and work with these empirically with these phenomena and ask mediums, or how do you think we should approach this idea? Develop a concept on our own and test it in the real world, or simply gather data and see what happens and reinterpret the data? What do you see? I don't know if I managed to be clear, but
yeah, that's a big question, and it's one we grapple with a lot. So I don't have a PhD, so I am not a trained philosopher. No. I am, however, an engineer. So my background's in computer science, and I build things. And so from that perspective, I am one to follow the data and then figure out a model later, which is a very unpopular position for me to have with most scientists or researchers. But I think at the end of the day, at least at the Windbridge Research Center, we're just really interested in how we can help people. So we follow the data, we make the observations, we collect the data based on those observations, and we do our best to collect those data and report them in the most accurate way that we can. And eventually someone smarter than us will develop these theories and models that will hopefully incorporate or encompass the work that we're doing. But at this point, we've sort of stepped away from that with a focus on applied research, and I don't want to say that it's not important, but we often will joke like, oh, that's kind of above our pay grade, because we know that if we can get a medium and a grieving person together under the right conditions, that person will stop suffering. And that to me is a far more important thing to be spending my time on than arguing with materialists over the development of a theory. That makes sense, and I'm sorry to sound sort of harsh around that, but that's my job.
Thank you, Mark and Rafael.
Raphael, you're muted as well.
Sorry. I understand that your research deal mostly with mental mediumship rather than trance mediumship. What is the particular reason for that choice? Is that because the trance mediumship is not very common in North America, or maybe the phenomenology of trance mediumship is less investigable?
Well, I would say, well, the first answer is the correct answer. Again, we study the mediums we study because they're the most popular type. We just don't encounter that many full trance mediums. I mean, they're out there certainly, and I don't want to say they don't exist or whatever, but they're not as common, and so they're more difficult to get at. Also, the bit about phenomenology is key, right? So when back in the early days, the Victorian era of mediumship in the US and the UK, mediums would go into full trance and they wouldn't have knowledge of the experience for the most part when they came out of it. And it wasn't, and again, I would love to be able to look at the literature and put up my finger on the time and date where this function of mediumship altered from this sort of full trance to the semi-trance to this sort of light altered state of consciousness that allows us today to ask that question about phenomenology that we couldn't ask 150 years ago because of the way mediumship worked back then. So yes to both of those questions, I guess. Thanks.
Okay, I think Humberto has the last one.
Okay, in our own research group here, probably in our experience at least, the main barrier against research on mediumship is cultural materialism. What are the main barriers or the main obstacles against this research in your experience?
So here in the US, the main objections are that come back to that materialism and that materialist-based science. Anytime we try, so in an academic setting, right? So whether we're trying to present at a conference or get published in a paper or even attract mainstream funding sources, the basic argument is mediumship isn't real because it can't exist. So any argument or data that say that it does exist must be fundamentally, by definition, flawed and inaccurate, or I'm a fraud, or the mediums are frauds. So that is the biggest obstacle, in my opinion, or that I encounter in terms of interfacing with established scientific institutions around this topic. We are seeing, now what's funny too is that a lot of people, not a lot, but I would say a couple of times a month, someone will email me and say, if you tell anyone this, I'll deny it because I'm worried about my job, but I think what you're doing is really cool and I want to be involved. So how can I run my own mediumship studies without telling anyone about it, that I'm doing it? So there's interest out there on an individual level, but yet institutions are not ready to get on board with it because of this entrenched materialism and sort of the stigma that comes out of it. And I think especially from the psychoanalytic community and the psychology community aren't really excited about these kinds of phenomena, whether it's mediumship specifically or other sorts of psychic type phenomena. And I'll just also say, sorry, I had one more thought, which is, and then all this translates back to funding, right? So we could be doing so much more if we had more funding. But Julie is the only full-time researcher here, and everybody else is a volunteer. And people often say to us, have you ever considered doing a research study about this or that? And we're like, yes, absolutely, and we would love to do that, but we simply don't have the resources or the funds to do it. So it's this back and forth between this materialist-based mindset, which then impacts our ability to get funding. I hope that answered your question.
Okay. There are many questions in the chat, but unfortunately our time doesn't allow us to prolong this session any longer. Thank you very much, Mark, for the excellent presentation. It will be great to have your presence as well as the presence of Dr. Beischel in new opportunities with us. I hope you enjoyed being with us too, and please say to Dr. Beischel that we all wish her a quick recovery, okay? And in sequence, I invite everyone to follow the last presentation of today at 40:30 through the link available on the USI channels on YouTube and Facebook. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much for having me.